Hey everyone, welcome back to Imaginary Lines. I'm one of your hosts, Keith Giles, and with Darrell Epp, the amazing poet. And this is episode 11 of the Imaginary Lines podcast. We thought for this episode, we'd take a little bit of a different direction. So we've had a great time the last 10 episodes. We've talked about movies. We've talked about art in general. We've talked about specific artists. We've done some poetry. We've done story time. We've read short stories, talked about stories and authors and writers and things like that. But we haven't jumped into something that so far that Joel and I both share a love for, and that is comics. So we thought, okay, let's do an episode where we talk about some of our favorite comics, and there's a lot. So, but this episode I've picked one. And then Darrell has one he wants to talk about as well. So I'll just say the one that I picked for this episode is one that I really love this comic. So it's called All-Star Superman. It's not, so I have to preface this by saying I am not a Superman fan. I don't like the character. I find him really boring. To me, it's extremely boring to have a character who basically is stronger than everybody else, faster than everybody else, can pretty much do anything you could possibly imagine. Yep, he can do that. He's invulnerable, he's invincible. He's strong, he's stronger than anyone could ever possibly be. You know, it's all these things. Of course, that's why he's Superman. He's a man to the max, right? But so on one hand, that's really cool, but it just makes the comics really boring. You know what I mean? Like there's no one to challenge him. There's nothing he can't do. And in the end, you start reading the comic, there might be some big problem or challenge or catastrophe going on. Oh no, what will Superman do? Well, of course, you know what he'll do and you know how it's going to end. Of course, in the end, he wins because he's Superman. So that just makes the character really boring for me. He's overpowered. Just a lot of things, a lot of complaints about the character. When it comes to DC Comics, to me, it's pretty much Batman and little else. However, so having said that, I'm not a huge fan of Superman. What I am a big fan of is the writer, Grant Morrison. I really like a lot of his stuff. As a person, he's a bit of a strange man. He wrote a book, what was it called? Super Gods, yes. Which is a fascinating book, but if you'll also read the book, you'll get his really great perspective on superheroes in general. And I really appreciate a lot of what he has to say about comics and things like that. But you'll also get to hear some of his personal stories of taking drug trips and meeting space aliens and demons and all kinds of crazy things. So he's an odd guy, to put it mildly. But I think he's a really great writer. He's written some of my favorite comics, which we'll talk about in future episodes. And in this All-Star Superman, it's illustrated by, honestly, one of my all-time favorite living comic book artists right now, which is a guy named Frank Quitely. Just to love his work. I mean, everything, I'm a huge fan of his artwork. So anytime Grant and Frank work together, it's a huge treat. I'd also recommend they have another book called Flex Mentalo, which is one of the first times they work together, and it's genius. We'll talk about that in an upcoming episode. And there's another one they did together, a short comic they did called We Three, which I'm pretty sure we'll talk about it in the future as well, which is another amazing collaboration. But an All-Star Superman, I think what Grant Morrison does, this is the reason why, is this is the only Superman comic I like. And it's because Grant pretty much deals with all those complaints I just mentioned about Superman. The fact that he's overpowered, the fact that there's no challenge for him, that he always wins in the end. I think what Grant understands about the character is that what makes Superman great isn't, and this is sort of the non-intuitive thing. And what makes Superman great isn't the fact that he's invulnerable, super strong, super fast, better than anybody else. It really is more the character of Clark Kent, the character of Superman, his heart, his desire to to be a servant, to help people on Earth. He sees himself as sort of a servant to humanity. The influence that his father, Jonathan Kent, who's this real simple, humble farmer, who lives in Smallville, and his mom, Martha, and just really how they instilled in him such a very strong sense of character. It's beautiful. Like he really pulls out of, he really focuses on what makes the character great, which isn't his powers. And the setup for the comic, which really kind of puts the whole thing in motion, is the idea that Superman is dying, which immediately right there, okay, you got me. This is interesting because Superman isn't immortal. He's not invulnerable. And it's not even about the kryptonite. So I think at the beginning, what sets it up is he's in space and he gets really close to the sun. And I think there's some suggestion later on that this was actually a plan that Lex Luthor had to lure him out into space because he suspected something like this might happen. So we know Superman gets his power from our yellow sun, right? He's from Krypton. They have a red sun on Krypton. And everyone else from Krypton is normal, just like us. But because Superman now comes from Krypton to Earth, our yellow sun has a strange effect on his physiology because he is an alien. And it's what gives him his superpowers. But when Superman flies almost essentially like, a few inches away from our sun, it sort of creates this chain reaction in his cells. I think, I don't know that they use this word, but essentially what it does is it accelerates his cells life cycle, and he's dying. I don't know if they say it's cancer. It's really just more of, I think, that his cells now are sort of accelerated to the point where now he's on the other side of the hill and he's now experiencing death. And he knows it's happening and he can't stop it. So when you have a Superman who knows he's going to die and who knows he has a limited amount of time to do good on the Earth, well, now now we can relate, right? I think all of us as human beings, we know we're going to die. And so right away, it's like, okay, wow. I mean, it's great to have these powers, but you're going to die soon. And so what would you do if you only had a few days or weeks or months to live? That brings a very interesting dynamic to Superman, which has never been there before. And I love that. I think I really appreciate what he does with it. So I don't know, you've read this before too, Darrell. What are some of your thoughts about this comic?
I don't want to be a party pooper, but I guess I didn't like it as much as you did.
Okay.
Yeah. First off, I guess everyone is a prisoner of their own time and space and that particular moment. And I actually remember being a big fan of Alan Moore in the 1980s, and now I'm not a fan of Alan Moore at all. Right. And I remember after Alan Moore was really screwed hard by DC and said, I'm not working for DC ever again, then immediately DC created Vertigo Comics. Yeah. And they said, hey kids, if you like Alan Moore, you're going to love Neil Gaiman. You're going to love Grant Morrison. You're going to love whoever, right? Yeah,
Warren Ellis.
Yeah. And it's the classic deal when non-creative types with power look at a phenomenon, all they can do is mimic the superficialities. Mm-hmm. Like when The Dark Knight Returns was a big hit, they were like, oh, wow, it must be because it was on glossy paper.
Right.
and had a spine.
Right.
Like a real book. So we'll just start printing everything on thicker paper with a spine, so it looks classy. That's why people bought The Dark Knight Returns, right?
Yeah.
And so you could really tell that these people at DC said, oh, wow, British guy, talks fancy, a lot of portentous caption boxes. That's the deal. So then they were really desperate when their cash cow left. So they really had this thing of like, oh, wow, hey, Alan Moore fans, he's gone. He doesn't exist anymore. Try Neil Gaiman. Right. And I really remember this happening. And it's like going to a Beatles concert and they give you the Monkees instead or something. And I'm like, no, I don't want the substitute.
Yeah.
get lost, right?
Yeah.
And then so Neil Gaiman had Sandman, which became a huge hit, which I thought was garbage. And then Grant Morrison had a comic called Arkham Asylum, which
Right.
was painted by the guy who did all the covers for the Sandman comics for 75 issues, Dave McKean.
Yes.
And I guess you could say I'm not a fan of Grant Morrison, and he doesn't seem like a really cool dude. And All-Star Superman was a good book, kind of. And one thing I agree with Grant Morrison on, he has said that the greatest writer in the history of comic books ever is John Broome.
I have no idea who that is.
John Broome is the greatest writer in the history of comics.
Oh, apparently. Okay.
And for about 7 years straight in the 1960s, he wrote The Flash and Green Lantern. And Grant Morrison has said he's never come anywhere close to the awesomeness of those comics, and he's right. And the whole thing about The Flash and Green Lantern, that's all like what you think of when you think of those guys. It's all John Broome in the 60s.
Mhm.
And what he would do, he would write these stories that were 12 pages long, totally self-contained, no to be continued soap opera stuff.
Mhm.
And he'd have this really weird fantasy setup and solve it with this fairy tale logic, and it was really magical. And then after DC fired him, he moved to Japan and got a job teaching English. And he's just an absolute master. And the whole thing about all the great Flash villains, all the great stuff the Green Lantern's power ring can do, that's all John Broome.
Wow.
And it's so funny. Like basically, the Silver Age of comics began with the Barry Allen Flash,
Mhm.
and in the first chapter, which is like I said, 12 pages or whatever, Barry Allen's like, "Oh wow, I just realized that I can run so fast. I can run faster than the speed of light, so I can actually move faster than the eye can process. So I'm basically invisible. That's cool." Then he's like, "I can run so fast that that the eye can't process it, so I can create mirages of myself. So people think I'm here, there when I'm long gone. That's cool." Then he says, "Oh, I just realized I can run faster than the speed of light, so I can actually travel through time."
Mhm.
Okay, great. And then he's like, "I just realized I can control the speed of my individual molecules, so I can actually diffuse them, so I can walk through walls." Okay, great. And every story,
Right.
until you basically realize the Flash can do whatever John Broome can think of.
Right.
And they really have this fairy tale logic to them that is really awesome. And so when you talk about Superman doesn't work because he's invulnerable and he can't be hurt and all this stuff, it's like you're speaking a different language, because for me, the primo age of Superman in the late 50s, early 60s, Wayne Boring was the house guy for Superman for a while, and then he made Superman have a really huge barrel chest,
Mhm.
and then Kurt Swan took over
Right.
and was the Superman artist for close to 30 years
That's
until
right.
John Byrne replaced him. And I think those Superman stories are some of the best comics ever. And I think the misunderstanding people have of them is a lot like the way people misunderstand John Cheever, where John Cheever gets published in the New Yorker. He seems really realistic, and then something goofy happens, or the plot gets kind of meta, or Deus Ex Machina, and people are like, "What is this?" And they don't get it's a fairy tale, like Italo Calvino or Luis Borges or whoever. So they just don't read it properly. And the
Mhm.
thing about Superman, he's invulnerable, so the stories don't. No, no, no. The Superman stories are fairy tales about loneliness. It's about being an alien, right?
Mhm.
And basically, for example, all these questions you have about why can't Superman die, right? Back then, they'd actually have stories where he would die, And then in the last box, they'd say, "Don't worry, kids. This was just an imaginary story."
Right.
So they actually have a box at the end where he reveals his identity, or he dies, or whatever, or he gets married.
Right.
Like
Or he has
he
a
always wanted to.
kid, because they had like
Yeah,
they had a whole storyline about his son and Batman's son.
yeah,
And yeah, there were all these
yeah,
like fantastical things where, yeah, almost every
yeah,
episode it was almost like a what if or a Elseworlds
yeah.
kind of thing.
And then at the end of this fictional story, that actually have a box saying, "Don't worry, kids. This was only just a fictional story. Don't
Unlike
worry
the other
about it."
ones, which are real.
Yeah. And one of the best, and it's kind of heartbreaking, Jerry Siegel really got screwed over, and then
Yeah,
uh, he signed away the rights for Superman.
like
Then
$100.
eventually had a job at DC Comics in the mail room, delivering mail for DC staffers.
Wow.
And one time in the '60s, he mailed a script to, I think it was Warren, who published Creepy and Eerie. And it was a story about a robot. And he'd written two versions of the story. And one was a G-rated script about a talking robot, and the other was a porno version. And when Jim Warren opened up the envelope with these filthy porno robot scripts from Jerry Siegel, who created the whole industry, Superman, bed bugs jumped out of the envelope.
Wow.
So the creator of Superman was living in an apartment with bed bugs and couldn't sell his scripts because people thought he wasn't hip or cool.
Yeah.
And the comic book industry is like so sleazy and so gross. It's just
yeah.
awful.
Yes.
So then eventually in late '60s, he was able to go back and as a freelancer and write scripts for the character he created, Superman. And he did a story called, which was the whole length of a comic, called "What If Krypton Hadn't Exploded?"
Mm.
And it was an imaginary story, so don't worry about it, right? But it was about what if Cal was allowed to fall in love and have a normal life. And it's a really sad story because it's actually a fairy tale, fantastic, artful way for Jerry Siegel to talk about his dreams that didn't come true and his experiences with loss
Yeah.
and regret. And it's absolutely fantastic.
Mm.
Also, in the '50s and '60s, there were a lot of stories by in the Superman comics that were written by Edmund Hamilton. And Edmund Hamilton was an actual science fiction novelist who wrote DC Comics at night.
Yeah.
So during the day, he wrote actual sci-fi novels, and his sci-fi novels featured battles with lightsabers in the 1940s.
Wow.
And there's so many stories from the late '50s and '60s written by Edmund Hamilton that are far better than anything Grant Morrison could ever do. And Edmund Hamilton was married to the woman who wrote The Empire Strikes Back.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Lee Brackett.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, very cool.
So Edmund Hamilton wrote an amazing story you should read. I think it's in Action Comics number 30, called Captive of the Yellow Sun, where Superman is chasing some villains, and he's chasing them so fast he breaks the time barrier and shoots himself into the year 3 million AD. And in this year, the sun has changed, so it doesn't give him the powers in the same way. And also, so he's kind of stuck. And also he finds that in the year 3 million, Homo sapiens, and I'm telling you, Edmund Hamilton wrote science fiction novels and wrote all these comics for DC as a gag on the sly.
Mm-hmm.
So he would give you a 12-page Superman story that was totally an Edmund Hamilton science fiction thing with all this great stuff, right? It's just like, for example, there was a great comic book writer called Otto Binder who wrote all the Captain Marvel. Mm-hmm. And then when Captain Marvel was sued out of business, he had a suitcase full of old scripts.
So hold on a minute. Which Captain Marvel? Shazam or the Marvel Captain Marvel?
Right.
Two of them.
This is Shazam in the 40s.
Got it.
Okay. So in the 40s, Captain Marvel, Shazam, sold way more copies than Superman did because the art by C.C. Beck was totally primo. So DC Comics said, "Oh, this is too close to Superman," and they sued them out of business.
Right.
And then when that happened, Otto Binder, who was also a science fiction novelist, he had a suitcase full of scripts about Mary Marvel, Captain Marvel Jr., and all this stuff.
Yeah.
So in the 60s, he wrote Supergirl for 10 years for DC. And all he did is he took his Mary Marvel, Captain Marvel scripts and changed Mary Marvel to Supergirl.
And no one noticed.
Well, it didn't matter. Yeah.
Right.
So Edmund Hamilton is a story called Captive of the Red Sun, where Superman is chasing and he flies so fast he goes into the future. And he finds out that Superman now has no powers because the sun is red or dark or something. And Homo sapiens had long since emigrated off Earth. So no one's there. And he's like, wow, this sucks. I'm all alone on Earth with only the powers of a regular human, and I have no one to talk to. So he ends up coming across a theme park where they have mechanical replicas of his old friends like Jimmy Olsen, and he starts talking to them, trying to avoid the insanity of all this loneliness, like in The Omega Man when Charlton Heston is playing chess with himself and all this.
Yes.
And eventually he walks to the North Pole to get into the Fortress of Solitude and go into the bottle city of Kandor and find a way to get back in time through there. But this whole story is about loneliness and just this idea about a guy who was already really lonely.
Yeah.
Just now having literally no one to talk to. And Captive of the Red Sun by Edmund Hamilton and Kurt Swan. It's pretty primo.
Yeah, that's awesome. That sounds really cool.
Yeah.
I've never read that one.
Okay, you're in for a real treat. And those stories by Siegel and Hamilton and Otto Binder, just think of them as like fractured fairy tales.
Yeah.
And you know, there's this old story where the editor of DC Comics at this time was Mort Weisinger, who apparently was a real monster and a bully and a tyrant. And apparently he would actually write down his dreams at night and take notes from the sessions he was having on the couch with his psychiatrist and turn those into Superman scripts. And he would actually go to playgrounds and go to kids and say, what do you want to see Jimmy Olsen turn into next?
Mm-hmm.
And he and Carmine Infantino were the guys who said, nothing sells comics like a talking gorilla on the cover.
Oh, yeah.
So, with the Flash, every issue of the Flash, he would turn into something. Like he'd have a big head, or he'd weigh 1,000 pounds. And he'd see himself in the mirror and be all humiliated. And then at the end, he'd fix it. And it sounds crazy, but all these stories really came out of like Mort Weisinger's psychotherapy sessions. And they were about humiliation and loneliness and all these human things that a stray dude in the 50s wouldn't talk about, but you could use as grist for the mill when you're in this disposable medium of comics.
Yeah. Yeah. Very
It's
interesting.
crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
So let me go back to All-Star Comics, All-Star Superman real quick.
And Frank Whiteley is a pseudonym. You know, it's like a play on. Yeah, it's a play on quite frankly.
Exactly.
Right? And he's from Scotland, and he's pretty accomplished. That's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I love his work a lot. So let me say what I like about All-Star Superman. The like I said, to me, bringing in the humanity of the character, and probably one of my favorite parts to the story. It's kind of like right in the middle of the story. There's a scene. So I'm just gonna read a little bit of this one scene. So it's basically it's Clark and his dad Pa Kent kind of standing out at night looking at the moon. And Pa Kent's talking to him and he says, "You maybe can't imagine how it was for us. Your ma and me, we've been married, oh, it must have been 10 years by then. And Lord knows, one thing after another, we both bitterly regretted that we couldn't have a child. You know me, Clark, I've never been much of one for sitting in church, but what else could I do? I came right out here and I prayed. I figured nothing would happen, but I had to try. Then one night, not long after, you came. Makes you wonder, huh? A childless couple blessed from above with a miracle boy from another world. How does that happen? And not just any boy, but the finest young fellow I've ever met. Look at you. You're destined for great things, Clark." And then there's this goofy little scene. So it's kind of, this is how it starts. The issue begins. And then, Clark's a little uncomfortable. He's getting kind of mushy. He does something kind of goofy. They bring in the stupid Crypto, the super dog. And so he kind of plays with Crypto dog a little bit. But while he's messing around with the dog, you see Pa Kent grab his chest, like in pain. He doesn't say anything, and Clark doesn't notice it. And then a couple of pages later, these Supermen from the future show up. And there's a bunch of them. And that's kind of cool because all these different Supermen from different dimensions and different eras in time and blah, blah, blah. And one of them is a character who's covered in bandages. And his face is covered in bandages and all this stuff. And anyway, they basically show up and they tell Clark, the Clark from that time period, sort of our Superman, that there's this thing coming called the Chronovore, but he doesn't need to worry about it. They're going to take care of it. But then when the thing shows up, they're all fighting it, and he keeps jumping in. In fact, some of these Supermen start trying to grab him and pull him off. "What are you doing? Stop! We told you we'll take care of it." And he insists. He ends up fighting them because he's no, this is my planet. I've got to save them. And he won't let these other Supermen do it without him, basically. I can take care of myself and all this stuff. You can't stop me. And so anyway, they end up stopping this creature, but then all of a sudden, one of the characters from the future, one of the Supermen from the future, he tells Superman, "I tried to warn you. If you face the Chronovore," this was the big villain they were fighting. "If you face the Chronovore, it will eat a precious 3 minutes of your life. And in those 3 minutes, Jonathan Kent suffered a fatal heart attack." And then suddenly he realizes he can't hear his father's heartbeat. So he flies as fast as he can. But of course, when he gets there, his father is dead. And what I loved about that story was just how, again, it's showing, and he even says it, he says to his mom, "What's the point of all my powers? What's the point of anything?" I didn't even get to say goodbye to his father. And that was just one of those things where it's like, yeah, even if you got all these powers, even if you could do all these amazing things, you can't stop your father's heart from stopping beating. There are things, again, that are limitations to all these great powers. You can't really save in the end the people that matter the most to you. And I just loved that. I thought that was a beautiful thing to point out in the story. And I also liked how all these other Supermen from all these other eras had come together on that, come through time on that day. And what they were trying to do was to give Superman those 3 minutes with his father. Like, that's how important it was. It was like, no, we've all got to come together because we want to give Clark those 3 minutes with his dad. And he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't cooperate, right? And there was just, again, there's just something driving him that, no, I've got to be the hero. I've got to rescue these people. I've got to be this, great hero for the people of Earth. And that, I don't know, there's just something in there, like, about how the combined might of every other Superman from every other timeline and dimension is incapable of stopping Superman from being who he is, from wanting to give of himself this way. Even when they're trying to use their power to help him avoid this great heartbreak that they all know because they've all experienced it themselves. And then it's revealed. So while the fight's going on, there's a side scene where while the fight's going on, all the Supermen are fighting the Chronovore. There's one character, he's not in the Superman suit. He's just a guy in just a regular clothing, but his face is bandaged up. And he has some quiet scenes with Jonathan Kent, with the father, kind of standing in the field. In fact, let me see if I can find some of that dialogue because it's really good. So it's sort of in the quiet of the storm, the scene cuts back, and this guy with the bandages is standing, and he goes, "Heck of a harvest, Mr. Kent." Kent says, Pa Kent says, you boys did a fine job. I always say it's about the work you put in that you get back. My wife wants us to up sticks back to Smallville. Minding the general store puts her right at the heart of business, she says. This is the end of the line for me and the farm. He'll be okay, won't he? The boy. And then the guy with the bandages says, it all comes out right in the end. And of course, after it's all over and the father dies and all that, the guy with the bandages takes the bandages off and it's him. And so in a way, he did get to come back through time and put on the bandages and spend those last 3 minutes with his dad, but not when it happened. He has to come back later, right, through time in the future. He's going to come back and get to have those 3 minutes at some point. Anyway, I just thought it was beautiful. It was just a wonderful way, I thought, to humanize the character, which for me is something that I really felt needed to happen. And it gave a lot of heart to the character. And then there's wonderful scenes like that. There's scenes where, like, one of the most heroic things that Superman does is he suddenly, you see a girl getting ready to kill herself. She's going to jump off the cliff, off a building, like a skyscraper. And then just instantly, he's standing behind her. He puts his hand on her shoulders, and he encourages her. So it's like, saving the planet, fighting monsters, all this kind of stuff. But it really, one of the most beautiful, heroic things he does is save this teenage girl's life. Not in any heroic way. He doesn't fly in at the last second and save her. He just kind of stands there next to her and puts his hand on her shoulders. It doesn't take any superpowers to do that. It just takes someone who has a heart, and has compassion and who decides to be there in that moment for someone, for a stranger. So those are the kind of things that I think that I'd never seen those in a Superman comic before. I'd never read anything like that and about that character before. And it, for me, because again, I just don't have any interest in the character. Those are my biases and I can't change that. But for me, what Grant Morrison did in All-Star Superman was phenomenal. I mean, it's why I love that comic. It's the only Superman comic I've ever bought. It's the only one I ever talk about. It's the only one I would ever recommend anybody, because I just feel like there's so much great stuff in it. And I won't spoil the ending, but the ending is fantastic. I really love the ending. I really love the way it wraps up. And again, to me, I hear what you're saying about, some of the older Silver Age kind of Superman stories, and they're fun and they're fantastic and everyone's wild and different every time. And that's cool. And I don't mind things like that. But what I really loved about the All-Star Superman was the heart of it. That it has some depth to it that the other Superman stories didn't have for me. And so, yeah, that's why I really loved it.
Okay. I'll start with the bad news and then the good news.
Okay.
The bad news is most of what you just said, I don't get it. So I don't get it. So first off, when you talk about finally Superman is being humanized or something, I'm like, what are you talking about? Because for me, I can remember if you read the first story, you know how he has a thing about meeting people whose initials are LL, right? So
Lex Luthor, Lois Lane. Yeah.
Yeah. Lana Lang.
Yeah.
So there was always this thing in the comics where will he go with Lois Lane from the big city or Lana Lang, who was his first crush in the small town?
Right.
And at one point it was revealed that the one true love of his life is actually Lori Lemaris, who is a mermaid.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Sorry, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yeah. So he can't marry Lois Lane or Lana Lang. no matter how many years in the comics they fight over him, because his heart belongs to Lori Lemaris, and he can't marry her because she's a fish.
That would pose a problem. Yes.
Yeah. So this story with where he meets Lori Lemaris, it's kind of like he's like, wow, he feels more at home in the world of the fish people than he does with Homo sapiens, because they're also freaks like he is, and he's not a human being. His whole life he's having to kind of pretend. And when he goes to the world of the mermaids, he's like, he can actually kind of get along, and he feels more at ease there than he does in New York or something.
Mm-hmm.
But he's still not a mermaid, and he has responsibilities to the surface dweller, blah, blah, blah. So it can't work out. And in the story, Edmund Hamilton actually uses these like film noir style flashbacks where Superman's flying, he's thinking about Lois, and then suddenly he remembers Lori Lemaris, the mermaid. And it's actually, when you read it, yeah, it's about a mermaid. So what? It's also about being a misfit, right?
Right.
You know, it's like there's a lot of great art, which is about an artist who's in pain from being a weirdo, but because it's so artfully wrapped, you can kind of swallow that pill, right?
Yeah.
It's like, you know, the song Waterloo Sunset by Ray Davies, right? It's probably like the greatest song ever written or something. And basically, he wrote that when he was 13 in the hospital, looking out the window. And he always thought it was too painful and too personal to actually release to the public. And then finally he did, and it's recognized as like maybe the best song ever. And Ray Davies really excelled at this thing about writing music where if you listen to the sound of it, it's full of hooks, it's catchy. You can bop your head to it, and it's just beautiful harmonies, melodies, arrangements. But if you actually listen to the lyric sheet, it's about all these songs. These beautiful harmonies and melodies are in service of lyrics that are about the pain of being a misfit.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually really chilling and really spine tingling. So this whole thing about, you know, like the stories of, you know, Superman from back in the day, they're full of human stuff where you may not be a mermaid, but you've all had failure or loss or dreams that didn't come true, right? And certainly Grant Morrison is the biggest fan of this stuff. And now we'll get to the good news.
Okay. I was waiting for the good news.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing where Grant Morrison is right, he and Alan Moore kind of represent these two divergent streams and what to do with the superhero.
Right.
Where Alan Moore created a big splash in 1986 with Watchmen, where he had this idea, what if superheroes were done realistic, right? Like if there was an actual Superman and he was on good terms with the White House, how would that affect the situation in Afghanistan?
Right.
Right? Questions like that are what happens in Watchmen, right? And Alan Moore was hoping that if he dissected the superhero concept like that, which he thinks is fascist and gross and creepy, Watchmen would serve as the epitaph for the superheroes, where he could hold this up to the light and say to people, look, come on, people, grow up, put on your big boy pants. And people would read it and go, oh, yeah, that's right. It's time to lay this concept to rest. But instead, the law of unintended consequences kicks in. And instead of being the epitaph for the superhero,
it's a new
it
life.
provided the biggest
rejuvenation
for the superhero ever, right? Alan was like, no, this is crap. I was trying to bury it. What are you doing, right? And then Grant Morrison comes along, and they have, and by the way, Alan Moore and Grant Morrison really like hate each other, maybe because they have so much in common. which is often
Well,
how it goes.
can I say, I don't know. I don't know if that's true. I think, and maybe I mean, you may know more about the specifics than I do. I kind of think Alan Moore hates Grant Morrison, but I don't think I've actually heard Grant Morrison talk about how he didn't even know there was a rivalry. He didn't think it was a big deal. But he's heard, since then, and he's tried to talk with Alan, and the walls are up, and he gets that, oh yeah, there's this animosity there. But I don't think Grant Morrison doesn't. I mean, there might be a rivalry in the sense. I do remember there was something where, there was a little bit of back and forth between the two of them over something. But I don't know. I didn't get the sense that Grant Morrison really doesn't like Alan Moore. I think he respects him as a comic writer, but he also recognizes that Alan Moore is not a fan of him.
Actually, you're correct. And let's just say Alan Moore actively dislikes Grant Morrison and has went on a great length about how he really despises him and views him as a parasite and a scammer and all this stuff, right? So then basically, Alan Moore is like, what if superheroes were real? How would being a superhero affect politics? All these things, right? And on the one hand, all these things that in 1986, like, oh wow, that's something I've never thought of. This will be better than those old corny Kurt Swan Superman stories. But actually, if you really turn it over, it's like, wait a minute, this is like the most corny stoner logic, where how everyone who gets stoned is like, you ever think about time and eternity and why Donald Duck doesn't wear pants? All this stupid stuff, right? It's just stupid. And then so Grant Morrison, he takes the opposite tack, where he's a British guy in love with the sound of his own voice, just like Alan Moore. But he says superheroes are awesome. And instead of pointing out what's wrong with them, Grant Morrison is like, he wants to use the superhero form to make his readers better and help his readers become gods. And Grant Morrison says, if you read a superhero comic and you wonder, well, where does Batman get the gas for the Batmobile? Right?
Right.
That's totally ridiculous. And maybe this just isn't for you. There's the door.
Right.
So all of these absurdities that people like Alan Moore pointed out, Grant Morrison's like, no, go with it. It's a dream. What's the matter with you?
Yeah.
Right. So that's one thing I really have to applaud, because the effects you can get in the late 50s, early 60s Superman, where he falls in love with a mermaid, or he thinks he's all alone in the universe, and then he realizes he has a cousin, and he's always trying to enlarge the bottle city of Kandor to their proper size and all this stuff. It sounds nuts, but it's like, because you don't know any mermaids in your real life, so the front part of your brain's saying, mermaids, LOL, that's just stupid. But at the same time, it's so well done, and the people who are making it are totally on board with it. Yeah, at the end, you're like, I thought this was going to be a corny story about a mermaid. Why is it so haunting? And why am I so impressed?
Yeah.
Right? That's the magic of art, right? So here's Grant Morrison saying, don't worry about where Batman gets the gas for the Batmobile. Come on.
Yeah. He's a billionaire. So, come on. He probably has his own oil refinery.
Yeah.
So let me say, this is actually
good for him on that.
Yeah. So this is really fascinating, because I think it's funny. This is the first time you and I have disagreed really on something, and it's comic books, which I think is hilarious. But
more important.
Yeah. No, but I love Grant Morrison. I really do. And to be honest, I like what you said about, the difference between Alan Moore and Grant Morrison. I agree with. And this is why I think I like Grant Morrison so much better, is that I think he's a great writer. I think, honestly, some of the best comics in this century were written by Grant Morrison. I really, not everything he does is great. I don't like everything he does. Some of his stuff I think is not that great. But I have read so many of his comics that I'm like, damn, that was awesome. What a great script. What a great, like the ones I mentioned, We Three, Flex Mentallo, which I think is genius, which we're going to talk about coming up. But yeah, so but again, that's what I like about Grant is that, and you get this from the Super Gods book that he wrote, which is just by the way, it's just a nonfiction story. It's just a kind of a personal memoir. But so it's it's not a comic story. It's just his personal story.
Yeah.
But you get in that story, and I also heard it in interviews from him. He loves comics. He's a fan. He loves comics. He loves these characters. Like you said, he called out, the greatest comic writers and why to him, because these are the ones he grew up with as a kid and what made them great. Whereas Alan Moore is very cynical and really doesn't like comics and kind of does them just sort of like, well, what the hell? This is my job. I'll write them, and I'll just write them in a way that tweaks things. And so I really appreciate that. I mean, not that I didn't. I mean, I loved Watchmen. I thought Watchmen was great. And honestly, probably my favorite Alan Moore comic is, I like Watchmen a lot, but I really, really liked League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which was a fantastic idea. It was a great concept where he kind of took literary characters from the past and basically imagined a world where all these guys really did exist. And so you've got like H.G. Wells' Invisible Man, you've got Captain Nemo, Captain of the Nautilus submarine. You've got, I can't remember her name, but it's the woman that was the lover of Dracula, Bram Stoker's Dracula, who herself is a vampire and has, these strength and powers and all these things. All these different characters where he pulls these literary characters in, and then they sort of like combine together to, stop some person, some great threat. And I just thought that was a genius idea, and the way he did it, pulling all these kind of characters together. It's written almost like a if you can imagine it, it's like, yeah, what if we were back way back, in what time frame would that be? 1800s, I guess, something like that. Or early 1900s. And what if these characters were real? And what if it was like a Magnificent Seven, where we have to like go around the globe and convince these different heroes and these different characters to work together to save the world, kind of a thing. So I just think it was a great concept, really well done, very well executed. And similarly, another comic that's kind of, and this kind of goes to your thing about, different other writers like Grant Morrison and Warren Ellis sort of being copycats of Alan Moore. But one of my favorite Warren Ellis comics is a very similar idea. It's called Planetary, which is a phenomenal series. It's a great story. But it's a similar thing where they kind of travel through time, and you get to see like Sherlock Holmes and The Shadow and Doc Savage and all these other characters, again, as if they were all real historical characters. They really did exist. Dracula's in there, all these other kind of characters as well. Lone Ranger. He pulls all these kind of retro kind of characters into the story, and it's one big, huge story that, spans, eons of time and pulls them all together. And it's really well done. I really like that. But yeah, I guess for me, Grant Morrison, I don't know. I guess I love when he's good. I'll put it this way. When Grant Morrison is good, he's very, very good. He's not always good, but to me, when he's on point, when he's in the zone, I think he does really great comics.
Okay, I took a few notes there. You mentioned League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Here's your fun movie trivia for the fact for the day. Do you know that League of Extraordinary Gentlemen is the movie that made Sean Connery retire?
Well, the movie sucks. And I'll tell you right now, do not watch that movie, because the movie ruins everything that's great about the comic. The comic is flawless. The movie is crap.
Yeah, so basically what happened was Sean Connery, who's worked with John Huston on The Man Who Would Be King.
Yeah, great movie, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah, Zardoz by John Boorman. science fiction classic, Outland, of course,
Yeah,
all this
like
stuff.
yeah, Outland was cool.
Yeah, yeah. And the funny thing about Zardoz is the movie asked the question: if you had a society where everyone was immortal and also telepathic, what would that society be like? And it's like, who was asking that question, right?
Right.
But anyhow, Zardoz will tell you, right?
Answer that question
So,
once and for all.
yeah. So that movie's pretty kick-ass about how primitive worship would have began, where they have that big giant floating head, and like you could kind of think, well, of course people would worship the rain or the sun because they know they die without it. That's a good starting point, right? And then you see a big floating Zardoz head, right? So basically, Sean Connery was on the set of The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and he looked around the set and said, "My God, they're all effing morons." And he noticed that the director and everyone around him was an effing moron. And then Sean Connery said to himself, "Why am I here? I don't need money." And he said, "Wait a minute, I have money. And like, what's the point in having money if you can't tell morons to F off?"
Right.
Right? So after that movie wrapped, he basically got a condo for him and his wife in the Bahamas. And at this condo place, a lot of the people there were the other residents. Some of them were people he'd been friends with for 50, 60 years. Some of the people he'd been friends with when he was in the army. So he would wake up in the morning and go golfing with his old buddies.
Wow.
And he's like, "Yeah, F you, world. I don't need this."
Right.
Because of League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
Well, there you go. That's one good thing that came out of that
That's the
movie.
one.
Sean
Yeah.
Connery realized the meaning of life.
Yeah, sure. And it's true. It's like, why work so hard? It's a kind of like Jack Nicholson to a degree, where he stopped making movies a few years ago just because he kind of felt like he didn't have anything left to prove, right?
Yeah.
And Jack Nicholson made a great movie called About Schmidt,
Oh, love that movie. Great movie.
which is a great movie,
Yes,
right?
it is.
Great. And then after that, the guy who made About Schmidt, he went to Jack Nicholson and said, "Hey, I've got a new script for you called Nebraska," right? And Jack Nicholson actually didn't have a lot of fun making About Schmidt. So he said, "No, leave me alone. I don't need this." So the director made the movie Nebraska with Bruce Dern.
Which is a phenomenal movie, dude. I love Nebraska.
It is.
It's a great movie.
But that part was meant for Jack.
But Bruce Dern owned it. He really did
Bruce
a great
Dern's
job.
awesome, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of funny where Jack Nicholson at his house, he has an art collection worth $100 million. And he's kind of like, and like he's had quite a bit of ego triumphs in his life. So he's like, it's going to take a lot to entice me to go outside, bro. It's not going to, right?
Right.
So sometimes you just get to that point. So with like Sean Connery, he's like, "What am I doing this for? I don't need this." Yeah, and also when you had said you thought Grant Morrison was one of the best comic book guys of the 21st century, that's part of the problem because the 21st century really isn't my bag, as the young kids say these days.
Yeah.
Where it's just not really my century, right? And most of the time when I'm reading for pleasure, it's writers from BC, and it's kind of funny. Like if you read Homer, the Iliad starts off, and in the first line it says, "This is a story about anger." So I'm like, great, I have problems with anger. Sign me up, right? And then on page 2, a god whispers in one of the characters' ears, and it entices him to go off in this different destructive direction. So I'm like, okay. And then there's fight scenes and a bunch of stabbings and
Sounds like a great
slashings.
comic. Yeah.
Yeah. And then a couple pages later, one of the main guys who's stabbing, says, "Man, I need some advice. Maybe I'll travel to the land of the dead and talk to the dead and see what wisdom they have." Because of course, you know, like I tend to read only dead writers because when you read, you're looking for wisdom and virtue, and that's what the dead are good at, right? So this character goes down to the land of the dead for a chapter or two, then just goes back to the battlefield. He's like, "Okay, I'm back. Let's go back to the stabbing," and it's so great and it's just so funny because in if you brought that into the contemporary world, the person at the bookstore would be like, "Well, what shelf do I put this book on?" Because I thought it was an action movie, but really it's got fantasy elements, religious elements. It's like, well, yeah, welcome to life. It's awesome. It's got everything,
Right.
right? And great art that actually haunts you. It isn't just the one thing, right?
Exactly.
So that's pretty great. And like the thing about like those things you like about Grant Morrison that you mentioned, it's like you don't stop and say, "Well, wait a minute. What about the laws of physics? What about," right? And it's kind of like, when we talked about Rothschild Fiddle by Chekhov, part of the thrill beyond the page turning quality of I have to turn the page to find what happens next is just the pleasure of knowing you're being taken for a ride by a master.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm going to try to write something tomorrow or maybe the day after. I'm going to try my best, but I'm pretty sure it's not going to be as good as Rothschild Fiddle. But it doesn't matter. And it's just when you're reading a story where you can see the guy is using all these different effects for these different payoffs, like how you're reading a story about Superman and the father's last heartbeats, and that means something to you, right? It's like, for me, it's like when you read Rothschild's Fiddle and somehow Chekhov actually makes you like bronze, right? That's not only does that say a lot about how you should treat your neighbor or how you should behave when the story's over and you go outside. It also just makes you want to stand up and cheer and salute and say, "Man, you did it. You pulled it off.
Yeah. Yeah.
You made a ballsy move there. You bet everything and you got away with it."
Yeah, exactly. That's beautiful.
So
Hey, so
yeah,
I
very
know
thrilling.
I know you had a comic as well. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yours?
Sure, as long as you're good for time, yeah.
I got a little
Also,
time.
okay. Also about the whole British invasion replacing Alan Moore thing. One thing that's funny about that, all these writers like when I'm reading a Grant Morrison comic, I'm like, is this even English? Am I holding the book upside down? I'm like, I just don't get it, right? And the one guy who came out of that I had some affection for was named Jamie Delano, and I think this is kind of where I was just in the right place at the right time. Like, how some books you like them, and then 20 years later you read them and you don't read it the same way or whatever. Right?
Sure.
So basically, one thing Alan Moore did that I think really holds up well is Swamp Thing. It really holds up to rereading really well. And in Swamp Thing, he created a character called John Constantine,
Oh
or
yeah.
John Constantine, as they say in
Yes.
England.
Yes.
And then eventually, um, DC decided to make a comic book just about that guy.
Yes.
And Alan Moore personally picked Jamie Delano to write this comic called Hellblazer. And before that, and he was just friends with him. And Jamie Delano was a cab driver. And then Alan Moore said, "Yeah, he can do it. Go for it." So he wrote the first about 35 issues of the Hellblazer comic. And I just bought them all when I was like 18 or 19. And they were so atmospheric and the characterization was so strong. And the writing was just really what I was looking for at that point. And that was a really fun time.
Yeah.
And then many years later, when my book After Hours came out, I actually mailed him a copy and just said, you're writing there was actually a point in like the 90s when I actually took a Jamie Delano story and tried to rewrite it, but set it in Hamilton instead of London or something, just as a practice for me. So I just sent him my book and said, hey, like, you were part of my journey, you know, thanks, right? And like, he was
Yeah.
very gracious and kind, and said he liked my book a lot. And like, that's really lovely, cool, right?
Yeah.
So there's that one guy who actually kind of worked for me, where I think it was just at that right point, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I guess, so I'm sure we'll be talking about comics again. So here's a comic that arrived in my mailbox this week, and it's
Hot off
by
the
Peter
press.
Bagge. Yeah, and this is a book called Credo, the Rose Wilder Lane story, and it's a comic book you should buy about Rose Wilder Lane. And basically, Rose Wilder Lane, she was it's a, I'm not sure how to set this up. Basically, Peter Bagge, in my opinion, is one of the greatest writers in the history of comic books. And I remember in the 1990s, I'd be sitting around thinking, man, I want to be a writer. But the thing is, nothing ever exciting happens to me. I don't have a time machine or anything like that. What do I do? All I do is sit around listening to old LPs in the basement. And then I saw Peter Bagge writing what I thought were fantastic stories with the most lapidary dialogue, and the most beautiful structure. And he was writing stories about a guy who hung out in the basement listening to old records.
Mm.
And that kind of inspired me to write some plays for the theater about bickering roommates. And then I had a great time working in the theater and all this stuff. And I just think he's a great writer. And for that era, there are two big books which people could investigate. And one is called Buddy Does Seattle, and another one is called Buddy Does New Jersey. And they're just like a master class in great writing.
Yeah.
And then around the year 2000, I started up a website to promote a book I self-published. And to create some content, I started doing interviews with people for the website. And he was one of the people I interviewed for this website. And we did it over AOL Messenger.
So it's
Which
just
is-
audio, right?
No, it was like us typing back and forth.
Oh, got it. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
You should share
And,
that, share it in the Facebook group. I think that's kind of cool.
Okay, cool. Yeah. And it was the first time I'd ever used like AOL Messenger, so it kind of gave me a hard time about typing so slow. And in like 2000, people were still like, the internet, what are you going to do with that? What's that for, right?
Right.
And then people said, you have an email address? What do you do with it? You know. So then I did this interview with him, and he was a really sweet, lovely guy, and he's just like the nicest guy in the comic book racket. So then a little while ago, I reached out to him and said, hey, guess what? It all worked out. My fourth professionally book just came out, and there were certain stories that he did back in the day that inspired me and helped me. So I wanted to share my joy with you, right? And then so he says, man, that's great. And he says, do you want to do a book swap? And then it was just kind of striking, because instead of like brushing me off or asking to see the book, he says, do you want to do a trade?
Yeah,
Treating me like we're equals,
that's nice.
right?
Yeah.
And he's just like the sweetest guy. So it's really nice. And yeah, he's just written so many great stories. And lately he's had this thing where he's doing nonfiction comics about remarkable women. And he wrote a book about Margaret Sanger, who was the creator of Planned Parenthood. And then he did a book about Zora Neale Hurston, the woman who wrote the book Their Eyes Were Watching God.
Oh yeah.
And then he
Oh
wrote
gosh.
this. Yeah. So he has a book called Fire, which is a biography of Zora Neale Hurston.
Cool.
And it's really kick-ass. And then this is his book Credo. And it's kind of funny. It's about a woman named Rose Wilder Lane, who was a pioneer of the libertarian movement. And Peter Bagge is a libertarian. And it's kind of funny where people in the arts and certainly in the comics tend to be left-wing politically. And comics have always been home to oddballs, eccentrics. It's pretty cool in that regard. And for example, Harold Gray, who was a comic book master and did a Little Orphan Annie, his politics were pretty much anti-FDR, libertarian, far right, kind of, but very much idiosyncratic, not like subscribing to any party platform, chapter and verse. And then the master of comics, Chester Gould, he had a really boundless, inventive, grotesque imagination that was astonishing. But he was also a hardcore 5-point tulip Calvinist from the Midwest.
Oh, wow.
So a lot of the glee he got from torturing criminals by putting matches between their toes and all that stuff was part of the Calvinist thing of, hey, they deserve it. Don't worry about it. Right?
Oh, yeah. And believe me, this is not the worst that's going to happen to them.
Yeah. This is just an appetizer, right?
This is nothing.
And then, of course, famously, Steve Ditko was a fan of Ayn Rand and objectivism, which was a big guiding point for him, right?
Yeah.
So then Peter Bagge's libertarian. So he wrote this book about this libertarian lady. And Rose Wilder Lane was a really interesting person. And she was the daughter of Laura Ingalls Wilder.
Oh, wow.
And very recently, it has come to light that Laura Ingalls Wilder didn't write the Little House on the Prairie books, that whole series.
Wow.
And that
who did?
Her daughter ghost wrote them for her.
Interesting. I did not know that. Wow. Hey, you guys, you heard it here. I heard it here first. Maybe you did too.
Yeah. So basically the idea about this nice old lady writing her memoirs, and they're like the Little House on the Prairie thing.
Sure.
That was a good story. But if they said these books were really ghost written by this anarchist, libertarian, atheist, manic depressive, strange lady, that wouldn't be good copy, right? So
although honestly, that might make me watch Little House on the Prairie, but go ahead.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Like the Michael Landon character in real life, he had like a ZZ Top beard and didn't look much like Michael Landon at all.
Right.
So that's another hard pill to swallow.
I want the director's cut. I want the I want to reboot a Little House on the Prairie with pulling all that in.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
So basically, this book starts off with Laura Ingalls Wilder traveling around the frontier, dealing with setbacks related to weather and all these hardships, and trying to find a stable place to raise a family. And then from the get-go, her daughter Rose was very different, very irreverent, iconoclastic, and grew up to be a really anti-government person, where during World War II, she would speak out against the war, which was a very controversial position then and all that stuff. And Rose Wilder always had this deal where because she was opposed to what the federal American government was doing, she always arranged her affairs so that she lived in poverty, so she never had to pay income tax. And when she would get a job as a newspaper columnist, she would actually lowball herself to get paid less to make sure she'd never have to pay income tax.
Well, that's an interesting way to do it.
Yeah. So so this book kind of talks about her role in the creation of the modern. It sounds funny when you say it out loud, where the big payoff in the book is showing her role in the creation of the modern American Libertarian Party. And
wow,
if you say, would you rather read a book about that or about Superman going through time, right? Not a lot of hands would go up.
Yeah,
But the
well,
thing is, this,
I know what I would say.
yeah. But this book is a testament to why comics are awesome.
Right.
Where you know how if there's a guy you really like, it's like, I don't care what the topic is. I'm going to buy the book because it's that guy that I like.
Yeah.
Um, uh, Basically, comics are a really cool medium in the Marshall McLuhan sense, and I think cooler than film. Comics have a lot in common with poetry, actually, the way they can uh, dilate time.
Yeah.
Where comics, let's say you have a panel in comics of me, and then next to it is a panel of me, but I have a big beard, then faster than you can consciously think of it, your brain says, oh, wow, this is 6 months later.
Yeah.
Right. And all that heavy lifting is done between the panels, and that's really magical.
Yeah.
Right. And that's great. And comics are awesome. Right.
Yeah.
So in this book, Peter Bagge has a very cartoony comic style, much more closer to Chester Gould than Alex Ross or something, which I think is the way to go. Yeah. And because in a comics panel with gesture and posture, in a split second, you suddenly get this bit of characterization that provides this human element that connects, which makes this more interesting than a prose book about the same subject might be.
Right.
So it's just a fun time.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's very cool. Well, I'll see. I'll have to check it out and see if it's at my library. But although my library sucks, so there's so many things they don't have. But yeah, that sounds really cool. And it's cool that you have a relationship, that connection with Peter Bagge. That's really cool.
Well, it's funny. Like he's just a really sweet guy, and he was a sweet guy back then. And he still is, right? And again, I have to say that he wrote a comic book in the 90s, which was called Hate, which features this main character called Buddy Bradley, where Buddy Bradley goes from Jersey to Seattle and back to Jersey. And now it's collected in 2 huge graphic novels called Buddy Does Seattle and Buddy Does New Jersey. And they are great comics. And about that, I have to say, you know how people say, don't meet your heroes because you'll always be disappointed. I'll use some free advice, kids. Free advice. Okay. Don't ever say that. Okay. Don't be that guy. Okay. Because when you say that, it's bad. Because what you're doing is you are asking another person to live up to your idealized version of them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You paint this fictional person, and then you meet the real person and say, oh, wow, he let me down. No, you let yourself down.
That's right.
He's a human being.
Don't
do that.
That's right.
Just be grateful for what you have.
Yeah.
And I've been fortunate to meet a lot of my heroes, and I've never been let down because I'm just like, hey, I'm grateful. The end.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So don't ever be that guy.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, I was really fortunate. So if several, probably 30 years ago. 30 years ago? Geez, maybe 25 years ago. Anyway, there was a long time ago. I was a writer for comicbookresources.com, which is cbr.com. Yeah. And it was a wonderful time in my life, actually, because the way that happened, I got to tell the story because it's actually really amazing. My firstborn son was ready to start first grade, and we were trying to decide, where to take him for school. And a whole bunch of our friends, in fact, all of our friends, pretty much at the time, their kids went to this private school, Christian school called Spirit Academy. And it was a hybrid thing where basically you're homeschooled. The kids are homeschooled like 3 days a week, and they spend 2 days a week in a classroom, like a normal classroom with teachers and other students. So they get the socialization, classroom experience a couple days a week. But then there's the homeschool element, the one-on-one with the parent on the 3 days of the week. So again, a lot of our friends were doing it. We kind of like that hybrid idea of a homeschool slash private school kind of thing. So, but we were kind of broke. I didn't have a full-time job. I was doing temp work. We were, kind of barely making our rent. And this school was expensive. So we went ahead and had a meeting with the principal of the school, which was actually a guy, we knew him. We went to church with him and his family. So Wendy and I meet with him. We find out about the school, how great it is, how cool it is, blah, blah, blah. Tour the classrooms, everything. And that was like a Tuesday night. And we're driving home, afterwards. And Wendy asked me, so what do you think? And I said, well, here's the thing. I think it's awesome. I think it's great. I also think that it's like $200 a month and we can't afford that. We don't have the money for that. So I said, if God wants us to put our kid in this school, he's going to have to, that money has to show up somewhere. We get home, my phone rings. I'm not making this up, by the way. This is true. We get home the same night, my phone rings. I answer the phone. It's the editor of Comic Book Resources. I had done some freelance for them. I had done a couple of interviews for them, and just for free. It was just to have my name out there, and I got to interview some of my heroes and comics and things. But he goes, Keith, I got a pitch for you. You let me know if you want to do this. He goes, I want to do CBR News, and what I need is a writer who, 4 or 5 times a week will write a news story. Keep us up to date with what's happening in the news, interview different creators, get to know the editors at Marvel and DC, and basically every day I want 2 or 3 stories, so we can have news going. And I said, that sounds great. And he goes, well, the bad news is this, man, I can only afford to pay you $200 a month. And he said, what do you think? I said, well, I think I'm going to say yes, because I just was in my car telling my wife, coming back from a school that costs $200 a month, that if God wanted us to put our kid in this school, he'd have to provide it. And you are the answer to that prayer, dude. So that's how I ended up writing for CBR for $200 a month. Because it was it was just crazy. It was one of these miraculous things. But because of that job, I got to interview Jim Steranko, who is, I think, one of the greatest comic book artists ever. I got to interview him, Joe Quesada, who is a great artist, but also at the time was the editor of Marvel Comics. I think he still is. I interviewed Stan Lee a couple of times. I got to interview Paul Pope, who was one of my heroes, indie comic writers and creators. I got to know that guy. I have his cell phone number, and we called and talked, and he even gave me some feedback on a science fiction story I was writing. I sent it to him. He read it. He came back. He told me what he liked, what he didn't like. It was really cool. I ended up getting to know some of these guys really well. I interviewed Bill Sienkiewicz, who's another artist who I think is probably one of the greatest comic artists ever. We can talk about him one of these days. I think Bill is amazing.
Sure, yeah.
But it was just a wonderful time. And so I feel really blessed in that respect, because I really did get to interview some of my favorite writers and artists, and more than once. I interviewed Kevin Smith, who's the movie director, and because he was also he did a phenomenal run of Daredevil comics. Really, one of my favorite Daredevil comics runs was Kevin Smith, and just phenomenal. We should talk about that one day too. It was just like a really cool thing. And so, like, your thing about when you meet your heroes and you meet these people, with one exception, I just put it that way, with the exception of one guy.
Who is it?
They were all outside in a second, because that's
Okay.
a story. That's a story too.
Right on.
But they were all amazing. Like Stan Lee was like talking to your grandpa, and Paul Pope was like talking to my next door neighbor. We talked about Philip K. Dick. We talked about science fiction. It was great. It was just so great. So it was wonderful. It was actually a really wonderful experience. So the one guy, I'm just going to say, and I'll try to be gracious, but I talked about, I don't think we hit record yet, but I was talking to you before we hit record about what comics we were going to talk about, and I mentioned one of them was Creature Tech, which I do think Creature Tech is a fantastic little graphic novel. It's really great. It's created by a guy named Doug Tenapel. He's the creator of a video game character called, what was his name? Something Jim. Earthworm Jim. Earthworm Jim. Earthworm Jim was a video game character, and then I think had a cartoon for a while, and he might have even done a comic out of it. And like I said, Creature Tech is so good. Doug Tenapel is a Christian, and he weaves and does it in a very good way. I mean, I really appreciated the very subtle ways that he introduced sort of questions of faith into a story, a comic story about a preacher's kid who rejects God, rejects faith, becomes a scientist. And there's some wonderful dialogue in Creature Tech where the unbelieving son is talking, faith and philosophy and God with his father, who's a preacher, who's a pastor, and they go back and forth. And those dialogues are great. They feel like real conversations. They don't feel like setups. It's not like we talked before, like the typical Christian things where they're straw man arguments, and so at the end the Christian guy nails it and problem solved. And it's not that at all. They're difficult questions that don't get resolved easily. And the way he introduces faith into the Creature Tech story is genius. It's still one of my all-time favorite ways. I would love to see a movie made of Creature Tech. It's just really beautiful. And so my disappointment when I interviewed Doug Tenapel, actually the interview itself was fine. I interviewed him, it got published on CBR. And actually, by the way, a lot of the interviews that I did with these guys, like Jim Steranko and Stan Lee and Doug Tenapel and all these guys, ended up getting republished in Tripwire magazine in the UK and in print, and then also got my Jim Steranko interview was republished in Comic Book Artist magazine, and that was really cool. That was like a big coup to get that interview because it was right after 9/11. Jim Steranko had some really fascinating things to say about 9/11, and my interview with him was probably the height of my comics journalism thing. But anyway, so I got to know Doug because of the interview, because I was such a fan of Creature Tech. I did the interview. The interview was great. It got published, but I felt a connection with him. He's a believer. He's a writer. He's an artist. And I sent him a sermon that I had preached at the church I was at because I just wanted to get his feedback. And that's when I discovered, oh, wow, this guy's kind of a jerk. And wow. He was, oh my gosh, it was so like, I mean, it wasn't just like, oh, I didn't like that, Keith, or I didn't agree with you on certain things. I mean, it was like, how insulting and condescending and hateful can I be as I critique this sermon that you sent me? And I was like, dude, really? Holy moly, what happened? And then I tried to like come back and kind of like, well, let's see if we can salvage this a little bit, And then he just doubled down on it. It was even worse. So it was like, basically, I guess he's a really hardcore Calvinist, and he didn't appreciate my non-Calvinistic theology, to put it mildly. But anyway, that was my big disappointment. Was like, well, crap. I still love that comic, and I still think he did a phenomenal job. And I've even read some of his other stuff since then, which I thought was good. I don't think anything I've read of his it hits the level of Creature Tech. Creature Tech to me is the best thing he ever did. It just kind of was like, I was a little disappointed then in that interaction with him. It kind of soured me a little bit, but whatever. He still put out a great comic, and you should still read it.
That's wild. Yeah, I read a book by him called Big Island, which I actually bought to give to my nieces, and I think it's about an island that turns out to be the back of a monster who's an alien.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Big Island. That's a good book.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. No, he does write really good kind of fantasy stuff, sci-fi fantasy stuff like that. And it usually has a lot of heart. That's what's so interesting to me is like, I guess it's a good thing. Like all of that hardcore Calvinism doesn't come out in any of his stuff, but that's a good thing because otherwise his audience would only be the very narrow niche Calvinist Christian market of comic book readers. So it's a good thing he's able to put that aside when he was writing his comics, because I think he does. He's a good writer, and he's a good artist, and he does have good ideas, and he puts good things together. Huh. Yeah, man. Well, so I think is that it? I think this is a good place to maybe wrap up our
Sure,
episode
great.
on comics. And it sounds like we have a lot of other things down the road. I'm sure we'll do another one on comics. There's a lot to talk about there. There's a lot of good stuff. And I think you and I can appreciate, I mean, here's the thing. This is the 11th episode, and this is the first time we've ever talked about comics. So,
Yeah.
so I think what people should get from this is, you and I have established that we like good art. We've talked about Chekhov. We talked about, we talked about literature, art, film, poetry, all these things. You and I have an appreciation, a really deep appreciation for good art. And you and I both really love comics. And I think for a lot of people, if they haven't discovered comics, maybe they didn't grow up reading comics as a kid, there's some great stuff out there in the comics world. If you appreciate good stories, you appreciate good art. Again, a lot of people don't think the comics could tick those boxes, but there are some phenomenal things out there. You and I have mentioned already in this conversation several things. And so I'm looking forward to in the future doing some more things on comics, hopefully broaden people's horizons on how great comics can really be and what makes them great. So yeah, man, this has been really good.
Definitely fantastic.
Yeah, man, thanks a lot.
Cool, great.